All right, next item on our agenda is the PMA presentation. Howie, you want to come up and tell us how good we're doing, what we got to watch out for, and appreciate you coming out tonight.
Anything that happens in Springfield.
Yes, that's
Right.
scary.
Howie Cross is with PMA, and we brought Howie on board about 4 years ago, my first year, to just do financial projections for the district. So Howie comes every November, December to give the board an idea of what the next fiscal year looks like and what the 5-year plan kind of looks like with our finances.
So this evening, we'd like to hit some of the highlights that are involved in the financial projections. On the next page, please, Marion. Thank you. The 15 budget is the basis for the projections going forward, and as well as projections of the assumptions on what the tax levies would be, what new property would be, what would happen with existing EAV, looking at enrollment and staffing ratios, and then blending in the salary schedule in your contract. On the third page, to note, of course, not that it's a surprise to any of you, you received finally the 2003 Capital Development Grant 10 years later, which amounted to approximately just under $9 million. And as you were talking earlier today in the meeting, that money was initially posited to the working cash fund, and over the course of the next this year and 3 more, is being transferred to the capital projects fund on an anticipated flow of payments to cover the projects across the street. So what you're going to see when we get to looking at the line graph is that's sort of an aberration, that grant. And because it's being used for the capital projects and being transferred over a period of time, if we simply looked at the cash in your operating funds, the Ed, O&M, transportation, IMRF, working cash, toward, you'd have this big blip in 2014 that you saw in your audit, and it drops significantly in 15 and then gradually goes down over the couple of years after that. So in discussions with Tim and Kevin, we felt it would be good to show not only that progression, but also if we simply took that grant out of the projections as if it didn't exist, or as if it was being transferred during FY15 in its entirety, what would the ending fund balances in your operating funds look like? So that's what you'll see when we get to that point. Okay, and we also, in relation to the board's goals, board policy, looking at a line that distinguishes what would be a fund balance equal to 20% of the expenditures in a given year in your operating funds. Okay. On page 4, the highlights, you do have a surplus projected this year in your operating funds, as we listed. Of course, 92% from local sources. That's the good news. The bad news is you still get 8% from the state and from the federal government. And I think there are, certainly in the projections going forward, we've been conservative, but not so conservative to take into account the worst that can happen to the district as the state goes through the budget crisis and tries to retrench with the unknowns of what its revenue is going to be, and certainly not knowing what general state aid, what categoricals are going to be there in the future years, as well as the concern that's come up in the last few weeks of whether the state will make all of its categorical payments in a timely basis by June 30th for FY15. Remember, the last 2 years, the state made up payments that it was behind, making up one of the payments that was behind in late June of 2013, and then again, the second payment it was behind in late June of 14. So anticipating it all come in was reasonable. We just have to wait and see whether the state actually, the comptroller actually releases the funds prior to June 30th. So on page 5, the graph showing that distribution, or where those funds come from, and the revenue side. And on page 6, the critical assumptions. As you heard, 1.5% is the CPI that controls your levy for this year. We're using 1.8% as the projection for levy year 15, the one that you will do next November, December. That number will come out about January 20th. We're anticipating that although it was close to 2% a couple of weeks ago, that it's going to drop some with gasoline prices dropping. We just don't know how much that will be. We've, from the information from the township, Tim is anticipating a decrease of about 8% in existing EAV this year. And then we've gone into the more typical pattern for Cook County that EAV would be flat the year after the reassessment and the year after that, and then going back to anticipating that EAV will start to go up with the next reassessment in 3 years at a 5% rate, and we just repeat that cycle. New property is estimated at $500,000. In previous years, we've used a number of $2 million, but we had a second year of new construction with the Levy 13 extension that was only about $500,000. So at direction from administration and the finance committee, we lowered that assessment to about $500,000. That does not generate a lot of money. It's about $13,500 for that $500,000 of new construction. We've again used the tax collection rate at 97%. That assumes that there will be property tax appeal board refunds and so forth that bring what, as Tim mentioned, really a collection of very, very close to 100% down to approximately 97%. We've used the proration this year of 89% on general state aid, and we've reduced that to 85% in subsequent years. You all know that the discussion, I'm sure, about Senate Bill 16 or whatever successor legislation might come up would effectively eliminate, I would guess, probably 80 or 90% of the funds that the state of Illinois sends to Riverside Brookfield. We've held revenues flat at the federal level. So you can see the chart on page 7 of EAV that reflects on page 8 the new construction change that we've made. Instead of being at the 2 million, bringing it back down. And then you see the general state aid projections over the next few years at 85% proration from FY16 through FY20 on page 9. So we are anticipating that that drop from 89% to 85% we'll see a drop in general state aid for the district next year. On the expenditure side, this sort of relates to the conversation you were having earlier. We use the expenditures by object, which is simply the way the district codes the type of expenditure. What do you spend money for? Not where do you spend it, but what do you spend it for? So salaries are one category, benefits are another. Supplies are the typical small individual items. The capital outlay, typically, as you saw, items that have a value, that are durable goods and have a value of over $1,000. That's usually a combination of board policy and work with your auditors and your insurance company because of the way it's audited. Other objects, that one's critical because a big portion of that is tuition student payments for students who are out of district, who are served not within the building but at other facilities, and your tuition. And I mention that because of all of the categories of expenditures, that's the one that we project the highest increase annually at about 10%. Those costs continue to rise, and most of our high school districts see larger increases because the students who are served out of the building are typically students whose cost of educational services in some sort of placement is extremely expensive.
That doesn't explain why it goes up by 10% a year.
One of the problems that most districts are facing is that there are limited number of facilities where students with significant issues can go for service, and in most cases there's not a lot of control by an outside agency of their costs.
That
I
explains
guess
why it
I'm
goes up by
trying to say that
10%.
nicely.
Okay.
You know that you have a contract in place through next year. The increase for next year on the base would be at 85% of CPI, reflecting the district's position that the majority of your revenue comes from local property taxes, and those would only go up at that rate. Future years to be negotiated. There's a couple of additional staff projected for FY16, as we discussed in preparation for that proposal later on for supplemental academic programming. Health insurance costs increasing 5 to 7% per year. Again, that's reflecting what would be the district's cost. It's as much a targeted as it is a guess of where the industry is going.
But
And most,
let me ask you, Tim, we've been seeing less than that, right?
We
With
have,
our-
but I think there's gonna be some impacts from the Affordable Care Act that are gonna start
Okay.
impacting premiums.
the other categories of expenditures, the purchase services, supplies, capital outlay, tuition, increasing for the most part at 2%, equating to our CPI projection. And there are technology improvements included in the assumptions of expenditures. So on page 12, you see the enrollment projections. Tim collects from the feeder districts, and then we move students through, and staffing projections corresponding to those. On page 14 is the breakout of the revenue by category, local, state, and federal. You see that for the most part, there's either a decline or flat on the state and federal level. Was noted on the other local revenue, you have a grant this next year that will go away from Aramark that will is a 1 year only. That's why other local revenue is dropping in 17. Otherwise, you see property taxes basically increasing at that 2% per year. On the expenditure side, I think we've hit the highlights of the things that are more than the CPI. Salaries fluctuate by where people are on the salary schedule and by the number of retirees that you have, and then whatever you're doing with additional staffing or reductions in staffing. The benefits primarily reflects that increase in the health costs. Purchase services, supplies, materials, capital outlay, essentially at 2% or less. The tuition and the other objects and the non-capitalized equipment shows that increase in the technology in 16 and then keeping it at that level. So when we bring those together, and we have on page 16, the revenue that you saw just collapsed a little bit. The expenditures also collapsed a little bit. And then in the middle, those other financing sources and uses, that's the planned transfer of funds from working cash to capital projects, out of your operating funds and into a designated fund for that expenditure. And you see that over that period of time through FY18, you've moved all of the money from working cash to capital projects and expended it. So when we look at the beginning fund balance there in 15, we're looking at the money coming in and then going out. The projected fund balances reflect as the cash in working cash not taken out of consideration. So with that, on page 17, it highlights perhaps easier what I was trying to get to. The red line shows what we're projecting to be your cash balance in your operating funds if you look at the audit report on June 30th of each year. The green line, however, is taking into account if we had moved the money from the capital development grant immediately to capital projects. And all we were looking at then was the actual funds in and out over a period of time. There's about a $2.3 million difference in the fund balance. That's more reflective of actual operations, not the one-time input of the capital development grant and the gradual transfer and expenditures out of working cash. So they coincide then in 18, which was when the plan transfers finished. And then the blue line is a line representing 20% of the expenditures in each of those years. So, this line is a little steeper than we've seen. I think we've been a little more conservative on the revenue estimates. And you see that you have some time, but some choices to look at over a period of time on where you as a district direct the finances to go.
What do you mean by we've been more conservative on the revenue estimates?
For example, lowering the new construction amounts, lowering the general state aid proration, changing the EAV assumptions, which has a very, very minor impact on the taxes. It really only applies to the new construction.
Well, why don't you stop there, because it gets
Sure.
is this a good projection? I mean, we're hiring you for your expertise to
Sure.
say whether we're doing a good projection, for instance. And then thinking about it, if you go back to the new growth EAV, can you explain why you were projecting 2 million and we convinced you to go down to 500,000?
Mhm.
Because we're hiring you for your expertise on what changed that you think we should go from 2 million to 500,000.
When we looked at the new growth over the past 10 years,
Mhm.
it had obviously peaked in about 2008 or 9.
Right.
And it had been coming down into that $4 to $3 million range, as you see even on that graph. And we
Well,
didn't know
the last
what
2 years,
third-
if this is accurate, it was only $200,000 2 years in a row, right?
Right,
According to this.
whatever it is
chart
there,
you have
yes.
here. Okay.
Go back to that page.
It's on page 8.
Okay.
Howie, could you give me a general sense of what we're talking about on a revenue impact? A range from, are we conservatively $3 million holding off? Are we $50,000 holding off?
The change from dropping from 2 million in a year to the 500,000 a year is probably about $50,000 from 13.
Okay, and when
to
we're
50.
projecting deficits of
Is it
half
okay
a
if he
million
answers my
to,
question, Gary?
what's that?
Do you mind if he answers my question?
Okay, I'm just trying to get a sense of what we're talking about here.
Okay.
When we're talking about $500,000
So am I.
deficits to $1.8 million deficits, or $1.4 million deficits.
So what has obviously occurred, and the district people know it better than I do, is that we had anticipated, I think, that new construction would pick back up, that there were some sites that might have been redeveloped, that housing development of the additions, renovations, whatever, would have picked back up. And since they haven't for 2 years, it seemed that to keep it at 2 million was not an appropriate level, that would be overly optimistic, given what we've seen the last 2 years. So we decided to come down to the 500,000.
And then going to what Gary's question is, the actual impact of our fund balance is only $50,000 making
For
that change?
for that portion, yes.
But some of the other ones also had an impact.
Right,
Okay.
This is 50,000 a year?
Yeah.
yes.
Okay.
Gary, you have any other question you want
In your 500,000 in one of the previous slides was an impact, that represented $13,000 in new taxes.
Right.
So, yeah, saying you might get taxed on $2 million of property was probably not appropriate, so we went down to perhaps getting taxed on $500,000 of new property.
I mean, maybe a bigger discussion would be is the amount of state aid and the amount of federal that we're getting. We're projecting a $100,000 decrease in state aid.
You're on
On page 106 of our board book, or 16 of Howie's presentation. All right, and then it just basically doesn't grow or stays flat. The federal government grants are staying flat. And maybe you can give us an assessment of, I know the state's in a mess and what have you, but there's no, maybe you can give us an assessment of state and you give us an assessment of what you see federal.
Well,
What you've seen from other districts too and what they're projecting.
Most everybody assumes that federal dollars will stay flat. There may be some variation, a very small one that might go up or down with enrollment, but your grants that are tied to enrollment are very small, so that would not be a significant change over 4 or 5 years. The ones that we're always concerned about is what would happen if the Congress actually passes a budget bill that takes money out of the Department of Education, and then we might see it. But since they've been frozen and haven't done that, almost all of our districts just project federal money flat. At the state level, I think any of the articles, particularly over the last few weeks after the election, highlight that the budget that was put together for FY15 at the state level included basically results from the rollback of the income tax and using $2 billion of money from special accounts and some of the bookkeeping things. $2 billion of revenue in this year's budget are not there in FY16. So the state's starting with a $6 billion hole to fill either by increasing revenue or decreasing expenditures or both. And I think that's where everybody is unsettled. And then when you layer on top of that the possibility that, which I don't believe will happen in the near future, I think because it's too big of an issue, the possibility that the entire general state aid formula would change and it would be more on a need basis, and the state sees Riverside, Brookfield as not needing any help except when it comes to telling you what you have to do.
And now on the other side, the expenditures, we're showing, we indicated that next year we're only getting 85% CPI on salaries and benefits, but yet we're showing a 4% increase in salary and benefits. I know some of it's due to health, and health is probably what 20% of that salary and benefits is, so I can understand kicking in some. But why were we projecting 4%?
One of the reasons there is that you have 2 additional staff members with an average expenditure of, I think, $60,000 when you count salary and benefits.
Probably
So
more than that.
maybe more than that. I'd have to go back and look at what
Closer to
number
80.
we're using for salary, and then the TRS is calculated on top of that, as is the additional health cost for 2 people. So if we're looking at about a $640,000 change, it would be easy to say that somewhere between 120 and 140,000 of that is attributable to adding 2 additional staff members. And the remainder is salary increases with the contract and the cost of health insurance.
So, the big
I'm
question.
sorry, can we go back to that?
Can I finish my question first, then you can go ahead and go back to it if you want?
Well, because it's on the same topic, Matt, that's all.
I was talking about the Senate Bill 16.
Okay, whatever you want.
So on Senate Bill 16, is it gonna pass or not?
No.
In your future?
No.
What about pensions coming back to us?
I think that will happen. I've thought that it was imminent. It's kept being pushed back. I don't believe that with the Supreme Court decision looming over the pension law and the anticipated, at least based on earlier Supreme Court decision and on the appellate court, that it will be found unconstitutional, just creates a bigger hole in the budget for FY16 that I think the legislature and governor will be scrambling to find ways to fill that hole. And it seems inevitable that at some point that cost shift will come down to local
So will
governments.
that cost shift coming down to the local governments, is an unfunded mandate, or will they help us? Will they give us anything for increasing levy or anything to cover it?
No. There won't be any relief from the tax cap for it.
Okay. John?
I think there'll be
Thanks.
something superficial that says you can charge it to IMRF Social Security, but you still have to operate within the limiting rate. So in effect, no change.
I just want to clarify the cost per each new FTE. You said it's more like, it's like 80
I'd say it's probably closer to 80, considering our BA1 is almost 58 or 60.
plus the benefits.
Right.
Okay, so 80,000. And two of those would be 160.
So roughly 25% of the 600,000 increase.
Yeah, so I still don't get, you sort of said part of it's health and part of it's, what was the other thing?
Salary
Well, we still have the teachers.
and steps.
So 25% would be 2 new teachers. And the 75%, can we break that down a little more? That's what I want.
We can, looking at your budgeted costs for health insurance and expecting those to go up in the 5 to 7% range, we could quantify that for you for each of those years as we're anticipating those costs to go up. The IMRF and Social Security benefits and the TRS benefits that are also included in there are really tied to salary increases. So if your classified employees have a salary increase of 3%, then that portion of the Social Security, IMRF Social Security Fund would go up by 3% as well.
So, I think as Ed alluded to, the big chunk would be 85%, or the CPI is going to go to the raises for the staff. So what, out of
Well, we
that,
still have 85% of CPI on the base, and then there was still a 2% step.
okay, so what, that total then is, out of 640, how much is that?
I'd be guessing.
It might have been broken down a slide or two before, Dr. Keen.
The salaries include all salaries, so that's everybody, including the non-teaching staff.
Okay,
Salaries
But
alone,
it-
Howie, were 3.5,
3.62.
6% on page 15, which is
15.
roughly accounted for almost 450,000.
Right.
So if you figure just the 450 in salaries and the 25% for 2 new teachers, there's most of your, close to your 600 just
so
there.
450 would be total salaries.
Yeah,
And
that's,
for teachers, it'd be how much, roughly?
Most of it,
I would guess it's probably a 300,000 plus or minus.
Okay.
or more.
So that's 300K. So
Because not only do
that's-
you have, the other component to the teacher salary increase is the cost of lane changes for those people who progress across your salary scale.
Okay, well, this is important for me in the future as we just look at this projected red ink, you know, how do we justify it? And I want to make it clear to me and to everyone else, you know, why, if we're going to go into deficit spending, you know, the purpose behind it. Because increasing class, or decreasing class sizes obviously costs money, and we have to know exactly, you know, how much money we're talking about to, you know, decrease our class size, because that's one option we have. So roughly, 2 new teachers, you're talking $160,000, and then 50% of the increase would be approximately 300K, which is basically their salary, that
certified salary.
certified salary in our contract. So how about going forward on these expenditures? How does that, these numbers, looks like they're sort of between 2 and 3%. Why the variation there? Because we don't have the contract, obviously, right?
I'm sorry?
We don't have the contract coming up,
Correct.
and so how do we get these numbers?
So there is a reduction in staff tied to enrollment that occurs in a couple of those years
Okay,
that brings it down. Your basic structure is a 2% step increase for those people who have not reached the bottom of a lane.
Right, so we use
Okay.
2% step, and we use 85% of 2% projection CPI.
1.7% base increase.
And then in his projection, if you go to page 13 or 103, you'll see that in 16, the FTE is 96. The next year it's 95, it stays flat, 94, 93. So as your staff fluctuates and your salaries increase and your staff gets a little older, I mean, there's multiple things
Variables.
going on, variables going on to get exactly what the dollar amount is. We go through that and put those assumptions in and come out with the numbers. But, you know, for him to tell us on the fly what exactly, he can tell us probably to the dollar what they are, but, you know, on the fly, it's very difficult because you have to, here's just something on page 13, page 103, that just shows you your staff fluctuates, okay? Then you have your contract in place until the end of next year, and then you have to estimate what's gonna go on after that. And your staff projections are based on your student enrollment projections, and it goes into the calculation that he's performing for us, and coming out with the presentation and the red line, green line that we were talking about before we started.
Let me add this, Kevin, to you. Are you happy with these certified staff projections, or do we see that potentially having to increase?
I think if anything, we probably would stay flat, even though the enrollment projections project a slight decrease. Because if the board's committed to trying to, if you go to page 13, we're at 96, then we go to 95, 95, 94. I think if the board's committed to the year after, the next year we're going to try to go freshman, sophomore core classes at 27 or 25 to 1. So the year after that, I would like to do juniors. The year after that I'd like to do seniors. So I
these
mean,
projections aren't
technically-
right.
Well, right, but I'm thinking
That's your
technically,
plan.
as you see 96 now, they're going down by a teacher because the enrollment's slightly going down. I would think if anything, we would try to remain flat to try to continue to low class sizes in math and English.
So Tim's really given us good projections, I noticed, you know, for the last several years. And I guess my question is, there's no surprises that, you know, we have to add 5 new teachers in the next 3 years.
I'm not anticipating it.
Okay, so the numbers we're seeing here are,
Pretty
they're
solid.
not good.
Pretty solid. We
Well,
also-
they're not good for our budget in terms of.
Well, no, we're as we
better
talked
than
about
you
at our
were before.
staffing enrollment, you know, the days of running a surplus or a balanced budget are gonna be tough for this district going forward, which means we would start tapping into working cash. And we have some things we're investigating with the Finance Council, with Howie, you know, refinancing, reissuing some bonds and some things to move some money around, keep people's tax dollars flat or decreased a little bit, but also helping us in the near future. But those are things that we can address. I think the thing you want to focus on page 16, even though there is some deficits coming up, projected deficits coming up. If you look at the bottom of the page with our fund balance as of expenditures, I mean, when I first started here, we were hovering around 23%. Is that accurate, Tim? I guess, 23, 25? And that's when we changed the board policy to go to 20%. I mean, it's recommended you stay around 30, 33%. So we still have a good 3 to 4 fiscal years where we should be having okay fund balance to help and give us some time to figure this out with the community and some of our options. The thing I'm nervous about is if you look at those state revenues, I highlighted that on my notes, is because if that Senate Bill 16 or a portion of that goes in with a proration or any type of pension shift, proration goes in, I would think you gotta think almost 200,000 more per year. So, you know, I don't think we'll see it for that first year, next year, which is a projection of about $500,000, but quickly come 17, that could be closer to $1 million and so forth.
So Howie, with everybody, the school districts you're talking to and working with, they're seeing the same thing we're seeing. Am I right?
Almost universally.
Almost. And what are they doing with it? What's their strategies going forward? Anything, or?
It would be the same for each of them, depending on how quickly that line is going down. Yours is not decreasing as quickly on a percentage basis as many of our districts. They are or have already cut staff after they've tried to eliminate whatever other expenditures they can. They've raised fees, like you saw with your athletic fees, for example. But that's a very small amount of money. Even in a budget of $23 million, when we look back at what's quote-unquote discretionary in those expenditure lines that is not salary, it's $6.5 million of $23 million. And there's some wiggle room there, but it's not usually 7 figures. And so if you're the districts that are faced with imminent disaster, if you will, far worse than yours, are looking at cutting staff and increasing class size.
So one of the revenue, and Tim, tell me if this is true or not, as North Riverside starts redeveloping the Edward Don site and start looking at a better strategy for their outlets, bringing in new restaurants, Chick-fil-A, all that stuff like that, that helps us revenue-wise, or does that do anything on the revenue side?
We don't see as much of
It's
that
new.
because a lot of that's sales tax,
Right.
and that's not what we get our.
There'd be some new EAV based on that.
Yeah,
It's gotta
but we
increase the
lost
value of
something for the
property.
Don
Yeah.
moving out.
You'd get an increase, like the $500,000 would bring you 13,000 in 1 year, but then on the next year, it's part of your denominator.
Right.
And whatever your levy is gonna be divvied up among all the properties, of which they are now one of all of the properties, with their property being the numerator and all the properties being the denominator, times our levy, that's what that property's gonna pay.
So let me go on, following up what Mike and Gary said. So on your page where you say the EAV is gonna go down by 8%, it's really a useless piece of information. I mean, people do that because of what Mike just said. It doesn't have an impact on what the taxes that we'll actually collect, right?
It has no impact on the taxes the district collects.
Right.
It has an impact on the tax rate
Right,
that an individual taxpayer.
right. So if you also go back to Gary's point, if we're being conservative and it's 100,000 on the state and it's maybe 50,000 on the new, and you throw that into the picture, so you're talking, you'd have at the end of 5 years, you'd have another 750,000. So you'd be down to about $1.1 million deficit then, right?
By 2020, Tim?
By
think so,
2020.
Jim.
I mean, there's a lot of other variables, including whether we're gonna have to pay for pension. So the other thing is, it seems to me, and I realize there's some limited ability we have, but with the 10% on the outside tuition, that's a $700,000 increase over the 5 years. If you look at what you can do, John talked about salaries and benefits, but are we that passive? I mean, is there something we can do about, we talked to other districts, talked to LADSI about why, talked to our legislatures, whoever, why, it's like college. People are finally saying, no, I'm not gonna pay 10% a year. You guys figure something else out. So is there anything that can be done on that? I mean, when you look at it in chunks, that's a pretty significant, that and transportation have been pretty significant increases
Right.
to us over the last few years.
One of the increases in staff for next year is projected is just because our special education enrollment alone is increasing.
Well, again,
Right.
that's a little bit different, though. We need to have a certain number of teachers or support people based on how many our special ed needs. But it's different of whether the outside people are going to, can just every year increase by
Increase by
10%.
We try to negotiate, we can continue to push that. That's why it's a private placement.
All right, any other questions for Howie? I think you got one more slide, the financial profile score projection.
Yeah, and it really reflects the information on the previous page. You would expect to slide slightly back down into the review category. It's not that you're in danger of anything from the state. You're one of the last ones they'll be looking at. They've got enough problems in other places, so It's not an oversight issue, it's simply one marker of financial health that comes out in the newspaper when report cards come out.
I think one thing the board needs to, as Howie mentioned earlier, as we prepare for some of the future deficits, is one of the things, a lot of the things that districts are first doing now are things that we did in your terms. When I got here 4 years ago, and 4 of you started with me 4 years ago, and Matt and Mike are starting their second term 2 years ago, but we kind of went after all the stuff that we could in regards to fees and class sizes and cooperatives for the benefits and cooperatives for insurance, and so we've kind of hit a lot of those strategies. So we really will have to look over the next 2 years of possibly a tax rate increase or refunding some bonds.
Yeah, I know, but I'd like to take a detailed look back at the things we looked at. So, for example, it kind of shocked me that football, the amount of dollars that football contributed was very little to that, and they're the costliest sport that we have. And if you look at that, there was, I think, 31 who got exempted out of paying. And so I'd like to address pay-to-play again, look at that and maybe there's a stratification that we need to do on those sports, those high-cost sports, things like that. I mean, I think we should, it's probably a good idea to look at all our, again.
The 31.
I know it's not going to generate
that's
a
free
lot of
and
revenue.
reduced- That's free and reduced students that population has continued to increase here.
I know, but
So as we try to
that's
find opportunities for our at-risk kids.
I think I calculated it to be 30% of the participants in the football program, which I thought we've always talked here that it's somewhere around 15% of the overall population. And I can understand that maybe, football draws, I don't know, but, I think it's something we need to discuss.
What about other curricular, and maybe that would be more of a question eventually for Kristen. Our C program, while it's very valuable, possibly those same goals could be done, or those classes could be taught in a different way where they're not as costly as they are now. Or maybe there's some other curricular restructuring so that we continue to minimize classes with less than 20 and.
And I think it'd be, that's what I was saying, I think it'd be a good exercise for us to readdress all those issues that we addressed day one here and see if there's something that we left on the table.
Absolutely.
All right, so
Constantly look at that.
it is, Howie, do we have any more questions for Howie?
Can I just make a comment? I really like the job Kevin did since he's been here, since I've been on the board, and I think it's extremely important to look at all this stuff and what Gary and Laura just said. I mean, we sort of are going to have to reevaluate constantly about what's worth keeping and what's not, because I'm really nervous about any kind of deficit spending. It bothers me. So, but I appreciate those comments.
All right. Howie, seeing none, thank you very much. Appreciate the analysis. As always, real good insight. Thank you.
Thank you, Howard.